everyone. And again, we really do apologise for our technical difficulties. We've been trying to get in since 6:30, and I've only just been able to join now. So once again, I do really apologise. My name is Jade Haitley, and I'm the chairperson of White Ribbon Victoria. And I'm coming to you live from Wadawurrung country, which is now called Ballarat. I do pay my respects to all First Nations people and elders on the lands across Australia where White Ribbon events are taking place today. And I further pay my respects to the more than 40 women who have lost their lives to domestic and family violence this year. Today's conversation is about eliminating all forms of men's violence against women. So I please request that you pay your utmost attention and respect to our amazing panel of speakers when they can join, and they have volunteered their time for this cause today. I am both proud and humbled to be joined by our speakers who are all frontline workers in their field, Daniel, Paddy and Scott, who I will introduce in full shortly. Before we properly begin, I would like to mention some administrations. Firstly, our chat function is enabled, so you can ask questions monitored by the White Ribbon Ballarat Committee. And as you've seen, Hilary is our moderator. We thank her for her technical assistance and hopefully getting this webinar up and running to you. I do also have two warnings. First, we will exclude anyone who isn't helping us to create a positive and safe space in the chat. We won't tolerate any misogyny, sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia. So please bring your best attitudes forward, especially in respect to our panel. And second, given the sensitive topic surrounding family and domestic violence, there may be triggering information. So if at any time you do need to step away from the screen or put us on mute, please do so. There are various organisations that you can call for assistance, details of which I've just linked in the chat. So let's begin. White Ribbon Ballarat has proudly been an active organisation within the community since the early 2000s and are committed to White Ribbon Australia's relaunched vision. White Ribbon Ballarat either host or attend various events throughout Ballarat and surrounding regions during the year, and we are often proudly backed by the White Ribbon Choir. Unfortunately, this year's session looks very different. Usually for White Ribbon Day, we're in person at a venue with over 500 seats. We provide a buffet breakfast, we have key speakers and backed by the White Ribbon Choir. But sadly, with the pandemic, that wasn't possible this year. But we've soldiered on, tried to create this webinar instead, and we thank you very, very much for your time and attention today. If there's anything discussed in this morning's webinar that is of interest to you, please, you can join our cause and assist further. So please don't hesitate to contact us at ballaratwhiteribonday@gmail.com. So men's violence against women is an ongoing epidemic in Australia, and sadly with COVID-19, that has only made the situation worse. Lockdowns and social distancing have not only created a spike in violence, but also reduced the ability of victims to seek help. Statistically, and I have gained these facts from Paddy's site, 1 in 3 women have experienced physical or sexual violence by a man since the age of 15. Police are called to attend family violence nationwide every 2 minutes, and approximately 1 woman a week is murdered by her current or former partner, with approximately 10 women per day hospitalised for assault injuries perpetrated by a spouse or a domestic partner. Australia's young women aged 18 to 24 experience higher rates of physical and sexual violence than older age demographics. 3 in 5 Indigenous women experience family violence, and statistically they are 32 times more likely to be hospitalised from family violence compared to non-Indigenous females. And then women with disabilities are 2 times more likely to experience sexual and intimate partner violence. Now, out of those harrowing and preventable statistics, we know that 94% of all of the types of violence, whether it's economic, social, financial, emotional, physical, is committed by men. And various research demonstrates that anywhere between 70 to 85% of all women indicate that they wouldn't report abuse. So out of those harrowing statistics, that's just the violence that we know about, which is really, really terrifying. So overall, violence against women costs the Australian economy an estimated $22 billion each year. White Ribbon recognises that this violence, it's not committed by all men. That statistic, that 94% perpetrated by men, sounds scary, but it's actually a small number of men, sometimes repeat offenders, and it can ruin the reputation of men. So we really need to work together to change the attitudes and social norms that excuse or condone disrespect, sexual harassment, and abuse. Gender inequality and learned behaviours are at the heart of this problem. We believe that no boy is born violent, so it is essential that men are a part of the solution to help make these beliefs a reality. And we know that you believe this too. That's why you're here today. This White Ribbon Day, we all need to play our part, and we need men who are that are a part of the solution to be equipped with the tools that they need to make change in themselves, their communities, and our society. White Ribbon takes a primary prevention approach to eliminating men's violence. We work to change the social conditions that are the drivers of gendered violence through self-reflection, education, workplace accreditation, and community-led prevention activities. Primary prevention means stopping the violence before it happens by addressing the root causes of men's violence against women. We know that to end violence against women, we must engage men, boys, and the broader society in this work. So, with White Ribbon Day being a day to talk about the impact of violence against women and what we can do in our everyday lives to make change, without any further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers. I am aware that we still don't have Daniel or Patty on board. Yes, I'll introduce, is it okay, Scott, if I'll introduce you first, now that our order's changed? Yep, beautiful, Scott's there. So Scott has worked in a number of roles, working with men who do harm, including practicing leadership, training, primary prevention, supervision, coordination, case management, and group facilitation. He has degrees that have supported his understanding of gendered violence, and he continues to be interested in exploring how we position ourselves in our work with men who do harm. Scott.
Great. Thanks, Jade. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for having me along, which feels like a really early morning, probably because it is. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on where I am, which is the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and young people who are stepping into and embracing their Indigenous heritage. I'd also like to acknowledge the disproportionate impact that family and domestic violence has on Aboriginal community members, and in particular women and children impacted by that violence. Thank you everyone, and as I said, welcome this morning. I like to, when I was invited on to the panel this morning, I was kind of thinking about how I would frame things and what I would talk about. I guess, given my experience, which has been probably about 15 years plus in the space of working with men who are identified as doing harm or using violence against their partners or their children. I thought it might be good to kind of explore a little bit about, what we do in our men's behaviour change space and how that might translate into broader community change. So what have we learned about what it means to support men to change their behaviour as individuals and part of a group in many occasions? But also, what are those learnings and how can that translate to all of us? And what are the opportunities, I guess, for us to look at some of those opportunities of learning that we've had and then applying them to the broader community context. So just a little bit about what men's behaviour change is, and particularly here at CAFS with Child and Family Services here in Ballarat. Currently, we run about four group programs, which is likely to change and increase to about 5 by the start of next year, which is 5 groups of men, roughly between 10 and 12 in number, who have been identified through numerous kind of pathways, I guess, which has changed over the years. 15 years ago, we had no real mechanism for mandating attendance in programs. So most of our programs are voluntary in nature. And since that time, things have changed quite significantly. And I think some of the work, even going back to the work of Christine Nixon and the reforms she initiated as police commissioner around really bringing gendered violence into the lens of the community and police responses, and then the following court response, has really had a significant impact in terms of how we then have been able to engage men. So most of the men who come into our program have either been are now probably mandated in some way, shape or form. So they've either coming from court through what's called counselling order, where there's been an intervention order and they've been asked to complete our program, or they have been asked by corrections, or they've been asked by child protection, a mandate like that. But they're often also, we also have a lot of voluntary clients who come through who have been identified that they need to address their behaviour, whether in their relationship or somebody in their life or they've just gotten to a point where they need to identify change. So the group programs last for 20 sessions for the men. Through that process, we really are working on helping them understand the gendered nature of violence, acknowledging and kind of owning the behaviour that they might have used in their current or previous relationships, the impact that behaviour's had on their family members, and in particular, I guess, the emotional impact and the physical impact that their harm has caused. We work in a co-facilitation model, so there's both a male and a female facilitator. And what we're trying to do in that space is I guess, kind of normalise gendered kind of relationships and role model good relationships between men and women in that space. That can be a really tricky space for female facilitators. I can't speak to that, but over the years, my experience has been, being one woman in a room full of men, and you might have a male colleague in there, that can be quite an isolating experience for a lot of female facilitators. Our real focus is on risk, essentially, in trying to manage risk and support. But what we are trying to do essentially is change men's behaviour, and how we go about that is it's kind of changed over the years in some way in terms of our learning and our understanding. When I first started, I thought my role was to hold men to account for the things they've done. And essentially what that looked like was me kind of arguing with them about the impact of their behaviour, and they needed to take responsibility. And it was pretty ineffectual. It didn't really do the job. I suspect that I was practicing in a way where I thought I was doing, the politically right thing. And I thought I was, speaking for women and children in those moments and perhaps I was, but I suspect I wasn't actually supporting their safety in that approach, because what I was getting was resistance, pushback, men kind of feeling confronted and challenged. And it was really, essentially they were kind of potentially elevating. I don't think that was always the case. Hopefully I wasn't that bad when I was working, but I question the kind of, now with the understanding we have about the work, there was some really strong learnings around, well, what does engagement look like, and how do we go through that in a really respectful way? So what there's many things we've learned over the years as we continue to work with men. So what's really important is when we work with men, we also, part of their engagement in our program is providing the details of their current or ex-partners. We would then have contact with them through a process called family safety contact, where we are supporting women and children throughout the process of our engagement with the man. But I guess one of the things that I like to think about is, when I think about what we've learned, a good place to start, I think, is what doesn't work. And what we've learned, I guess, is that sympathising with the men we work with just reinforces their violence or their abuse. So we would call that colluding. That's a term that we would use for it, where we're essentially reinforcing their beliefs about their violence and their abuse, that this is a system's fault, that the system's got it in for men, that this is their partner's fault, she's crazy, she's got this issue, she's got that issue, it's her family's fault, it's everybody else's fault essentially but theirs. And we don't buy into that, and we don't sympathise with that, because all we do in doing that is we might engage him for a little bit longer, but we're actually just reinforcing his use of violence and the behaviour that we're there to address in the first place. Likewise, I guess, and this is kind of an interesting thing, because when I hear the kind of language we often use when we're talking about ending violence, it's often about challenging and confronting men's use of violence. And what we found, I guess, over the years is that challenging and confronting just reinforces their violence. So if I want to challenge and confront somebody and I do that in a disrespectful way, they end up, all they're thinking about is my behaviour, and they're not thinking about their behaviour. And that's what we want. We want to engage in a way where they are thinking about their behaviour. They're thinking about their choices, their beliefs, their attitudes, their values. That's a really important part of our work, in that, and if we do that in a confrontational way, not only do they become defensive and even more resistant, what we're doing is we're displaying a power over approach in our interaction with them, and we're reinforcing violence in our own behaviour. So that's a really important kind of learning for us around, how do we work with men in a way that is respectful, and I'll talk about some of the things, I guess, that we kind of we kind of know works a bit. And one of those things, and it's kind of sounds a little bit obvious really, but is the idea that we actually listen to them. We listen to their position, we listen to their beliefs, and often that means listening to things that is really uncomfortable. And that doesn't mean that we're not outraged by the things we hear, and we're not outraged by the behaviour that we know most of the men, or a lot of the men we work with, perpetrate against their partners and ex-partners. We are outraged by that. But what we ground ourselves in is that our outrage can't drive our intervention, because that doesn't lead to change. That's fine for me to be outraged in that moment with that man. And I might feel good because I'm, disgusted, and I'm going to convey that disgust towards him, but that's not going to support change, and that's not going to support the safety for that man's partner and the children in that man's life. So, where we start with is we listen to what they say. That doesn't mean we acknowledge that what they're saying is necessarily true or factual, but we listen, because we all know, and I think, all of us on this call know, that if you want people to listen to you, you have to listen to them. And that's part of the engagement process for us, and ongoing. And as we go along in our engagement with them, we will invite reflections more and more around the things they've said and their own understanding of their beliefs, and unpack them a little bit. So what we're trying to do is, and most of the men we work with are not different to the rest of us in so many ways. They share the same values. They want fairness. They want equality. They want respect. They want loving relationships. That's what they want, and they're the values they kind of want to convey in their relationship. But for a multitude of reasons, they don't do that. And what we are kind of trying to get them to a point of is to understand the discrepancy between their behaviour and the impact of their use of violence on the people in their lives and their stated values and what they want to work towards. And in that discrepancy, that space where they're able to acknowledge that their behaviour doesn't reflect what they are wanting for the people in their lives or for themselves, that's where there's a real opportunity for change and an opportunity to start looking at, well, what can be different and how can they be different in their relationship? Now, that's a vast majority of clients we have. In terms of the really significant high risk clients, and I'm talking about the men who are really conscious of their violence, they plan their violence, they manipulate consciously. That's a really rare presentation we would have, in our men's behaviour change program, potentially 1 in 20. And our group program may not be the best place for those men, because what they will do is use the knowledge from that group and then use that to manipulate their partner even more. So we would pull them out of that space and do work with them one-on-one. The other thing that we really believe is important, and we use this word quite often in our work, is the idea of being curious and invitational. So when we're hearing things that men are saying that are blaming, denying, justifying, minimising, which is not unusual, and I think this is really important. When it's kind of projected onto the men we work with, well, they do all this because they want to avoid responsibility. Most of us do the same things when we want to avoid responsibility, and that's an important part of how we work. Is that it doesn't help to other the men. Some of the processes, some of the thought processes. If I've done, I think about my own past behaviour, and when I've done things that I'm ashamed of or embarrassed about or really remorseful about, how I speak to the world about that is through minimising the impact on others. It's through justifying why I did what I did. So we acknowledge that that's not an unusual presentation and is part of the package of what we get when we're working with the men we work with. So what we're really interested in is working in a way that is really curious and invitational, that supports and encourages them to reflect on their behaviour and their beliefs and their attitudes, that encourages them to kind of think about the impact of those things on their partners and on their children, so that they can get to a point of where they're able to kind of identify themselves rather than us telling them what they need to do to change. That's really important. We're not about telling them or teaching them. We're about supporting them to get to a point where they need to change, where they identify the change they need to make. And rather than us holding them accountable for what they've done, we want them to get to a position where they're accountable to their family members for their behaviours. So through all that, the other thing that I guess we've kind of landed at in many ways is that we recognise that family violence and violence against women exists on a continuum. And myself as a man, I hold power and privilege that I've used to my benefit. I have no doubt about that, and I probably continue to do in an unconscious way. So the idea somehow that the men we work with exist on a different continuum, we kind of don't take that approach. We are on the same journey that the men are, and I think about my own kind of experience over the years of being with the men we work with, how much I've learned about myself and how I hold power, how I use control, And I guess that's a really important thing, is we don't kind of other the men. We work with them. We go on the same journey that they're on. We learn about ourselves through that process, and that's a really important part of the work that we do. Is that if we kind of sit back and pretend as if we're totally different and don't exist in the same social structure that they do, then we're kind of doing their family members who are impacted by violence a disservice. And when we think about what works for ourselves in terms of change, it's when people walk with us. It's when people support us. It's when people encourage and invite and are really curious about what are the things we want to do differently. Change doesn't really happen when we force it on people. It would make the work a whole lot easier if we could. That'd be great. But that's just not been, the experience over the years. So, in turn, and this is kind of the big question in terms of those learnings. What does that mean for change in the community? And if you need me to wrap up, Jade, give me a hoy. But what does change look like when I think about those learnings, when I think about what does change look like in our communities, and particularly for the men in the call in this session, it really does. The starting point has to be ourselves and our own relationship with gender and our own relationship with gendered norms, our own belief and our own understanding of how we've been socialized to reinforce the gendered norms. So this is not just about violence. This is about power, and this is about control. And I often find it not funny, a little bit disturbing sometimes, and frustrating when, sorry, I might go on a political rant here, but when we talk to, we say to men who use violence, well, they need to be accountable and they need to take responsibility. And I look in our communities and at a national level, I look at our leaders, and they don't do it. They don't do it, but we want other people to do it. And this is the challenge for us. So for me, any social change, it has to start with ourselves and our own kind of knowledge and understanding of our relationship with power, with gender. How do we hold space, particularly for the men in the call, as I said? How do we hold space? How do we limit women's experience? How do we socialize and genderize? I don't know whether that's a word, but I'm using it this morning. Genderize people in our lives and take gendered positions constantly. For people who are in businesses or in community leadership, how do you lead in a way that reinforces gendered norms? How might you use power yourself in your business or in your community leadership role that really does reinforce and diminish the experience of others? Because that's what we're talking about when we're talking about family and domestic violence. So, I've thought a lot about this over the years, is this kind of translation of the knowledge that we have in working with men and what creates change. How do we then translate that into broader community change? And it's got to start with ourselves. If we're going to point the finger at others, we need to know how we're positioned in relation to these issues. And if we are going to finger point and blame, and if we are going to use our power or our authority to make people do things, to use power over, how is that different to what men who use violence do in their relationship? That's a question that we all have to answer. And I think, on White Ribbon Day, where we are kind of reflecting, this is a real opportunity for all of us to reflect on how we might want our community to be different, and what might we want to bring of ourselves into that community so that we can be the change that we want to see, and that we can interact in a way that really does support a broader social change, so that we don't have these underlying structures that I'm sure Paddy's going to talk about that reinforce violence and allow violence and abuse to happen, and they're normalised. And that, I think, is on White Ribbon Day, that's what I would encourage everyone to consider and think about. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time and wealth of information, Scott. That was really fantastic. We've learned what doesn't work with men's behavioural change, how it translates in the community, and really how much it does come down to self-reflection, really, and starting on that individual level. We do have a question for you, Scott, but I'll maybe throw it to the end. But most importantly, we will get on to Paddy. So I would like to thank you, Scott. I would now like to introduce Paddy Kinnersley. She's the Chief Executive Officer of Our Watch. It's a non-profit organisation that leads Australia's work to prevent violence against women and their children. Paddy has extensive experience in women's health, community services, education and governance. And don't hold this one against her, but she is currently a member of the Carlton Football Club Board of Directors. Thank you, Paddy.
Thanks very much, Jade. It depends what room I'm in. Some people love that and some people don't. Can I just start by firstly acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us here today. Thanks so much to the White Ribbon Ballarat Committee for inviting me to join you this morning for this really important event. And I know that the theme for White Ribbon Day this year is how can men make change? And I found Scott's presentation to be incredibly interesting and enlightening. And I think it's fair to say that it's confronting to hear Scott tell his experiences of working with men who perpetrate violence, and challenging and a bit heartbreaking, but I also insightful. And the way that you articulated that, Scott, I found actually quite inspiring. So, I mean, on behalf of everybody on this call, thank you, but thank you for the work that you do and the continued commitment of organisation like CAPS. Whilst Our Watch focuses its work on primary prevention, stopping violence before it starts, we absolutely know we need continued work at the front end, either supporting women who are victims of or escaping violence against women, or people like Scott doing his work to work with men who are perpetrators of violence. So thank you so much, Scott. I actually could have listened to you for longer, really. So I think probably from my perspective, when we listen to the stats that Jade shared with us at the start, or Scott's experiences, and we understand the extent of the problem, it's actually easy to feel overwhelmed and not know where to start in order to help make change. Or the other thing that people sometimes feel, I hear, is that the experience is so far from your own life that it feels like it's not really something that you can engage with or worry about, or perhaps it's not your business and even not your responsibility if it's not in your life. I think the fact that you're here means that the latter is not the case. In fact, you are interested, you are worried about it, and you do want to be able to make change or contribute to change, which is great, because that's the journey that we need to go on as a country, as individuals, but in a broader sense, in how everybody interacts in the country and how we work together to drive change. Because violence against women is, in fact, a national emergency, and it's something that nobody is comfortable with. I don't think women being free from violence is enough. I think that's only a starting point. We actually need a community where women are free to thrive and make choices about how they contribute, and they're not limited by the fact that they're women. So in the next 15 minutes or so, I'm clearly not going really deep on the evidence base or on how you can make change, but I'll make a start. Scott's talked beautifully about our role as individuals and our need to reflect. It's absolutely a starting point. It doesn't matter if you're in the leadership roles or you're an individual just thinking about how you do your version of masculinity or your version of leadership in your own household. Reflection is the starting point. But I'm going to focus on men in leadership roles and roles of influence. So if we think about the evidence base, a little micro dose of that, we know that if we're going to drive change or make change in any issue, we need to know what's driving violence against women, or we need to know what's driving the issue at hand. So we need to go back to the start. What's driving the problem? What actions are needed in order to fix the problem? And what role do we play as individuals or as a part of the bigger system? So we're actually quite fortunate in Australia that we have a document called Change the Story, and it was launched in 2015, and it's a national framework for the prevention of violence against women. It drew on national and international evidence at the time. It's actually just about to be reviewed, and we're launching an update of that next week. But that document tells us, or the evidence tells us, that it is in fact gender inequality playing out in all the places we spend most of our time, work, sport, home, church, in the media, that is actually driving violence against women, that's establishing an environment where violence is more likely to occur. But in order to make that a bit more accessible, we say there's 4 particular expressions of gender inequality, if you like, that are more likely to create an environment where violence can occur. And they're the dismissing or condoning of violence against women. So he was under stress, it's been a hard week. Why was she running with the headphones in? What did she expect going out with a footballer? These things that actually dismiss the violence or actually condone it. Secondly, men's control of decision-making and limits on women's independence. So in our community, who is making most of the decisions most of the time, but on behalf of the whole community? We are in a situation still where most of the time men are making key decisions on behalf of the whole community, and often without understanding how they're limiting women's independence as a part of doing that. Economic independence is a really obvious example of that. And as we're emerging from the COVID, we talked about the economic recovery of putting money into mining and construction and so forth, and inadvertently advantaging women and disadvantaging men. We know about the gender pay gap, women with poor superannuation when they finish and so forth. Thirdly, the stereotype constructs of masculinity and femininity. And this is particularly relevant when we talk about the versions of masculinity that people are quite rigid about, that men should be tough and stoic and in control and in charge and be the boss of women, as it were. We often hear about things like, now that we're going out, I control her finances. Well, it's now that she's my partner, it's all right for me to track her on the phone. Those sorts of things that are actually about connecting behaviours to a version of masculinity, only one version, that's really rigidly held to. We know that there's evidence that's telling us that men who adhere to that really rigid version of masculinity are also men who are more likely to be perpetrating violence. And disrespect towards women in male peer relations, particularly where women are used as a way of gaining credibility. So the sexist joke, or discriminating against women as a way of men bonding. So the important thing about that is that these drivers of violence against women that we talk about, they are playing out in all of the places we spend our time, and kind of creating an environment where women are not as seen as equal. I'm going to, as long as the tech is working okay, just show you a 4-minute clip that kind of really puts all this together in a really accessible way. Some of you will have seen this clip before. It's called the Change the Story clip. But I'd ask you today, with that view of how can men make change, to view this clip through the lens of how can I take this information to help me make change? And whilst that applies to everybody, this event is about men making change. So the invitation is especially for you. So I'll just share my screen, maybe. And I'll make that the full page, and I'll share that.
This is the story of a boy and a girl. It's a universal story and an Australian story. It's a story that occurs every 2 minutes, in fact. A story that happens 657 times a day, every day of the year, and in every kind of household and every city and region across Australia. This is the biggest story behind violence against women. This story doesn't have a happy ending, because this is the story of how gender inequality contributes to the murder of one Australian woman almost every week. Sounds like a tall tale, right? Let's take things back to the start. Here's the story of a regular woman. As a girl, she gets told how pretty she is, never how clever she is, that if she wears a short dress, she's asking for it. She grows up and gets used to being harassed by men on the street. That's just the way it is. Here's the story of a regular man. As a boy, he learns that women aren't equal to men from a very early age. Even though both his parents work, on the weekends his mum does the housework while Dad watches sport. When he cries about being bullied at school, his dad tells him to stop being such a girl and just punch him right back. Technically speaking, we'd say that these social norms, practices and structures have shaped both the boy and the girl, creating a society where women are valued less and men are expected to be dominant and in control. In such a world, disrespect and hostility is excused and violence against women is far more likely. But back to our story. The girl grows up into a woman, the boy grows into a man, and they begin to date. He jokes that he hopes she doesn't get fat now that we're together. She's not sure whether she should laugh. They have the same education and do similar work, yet he earns more money. He's quickly promoted, like other men in the company, while she gets overlooked. At home, she does all the household chores, and he takes control of their joint finances, seeing as he's the main breadwinner and all. When they're at the pub, he puts her down in front of his mates. His friends stay quiet. In the morning, he wakes up and blames the alcohol and stress. He always has an excuse. When she gets pregnant, her boss says she can't come back part-time. After the baby is born, the lack of flexible job opportunities and childcare keeps her out of the workforce. She is socially isolated and financially dependent on him. He controls decision-making, and her. They are not equals. She is dependent on him for everything. So she never tells anyone that he has started to hit her. She doesn't say anything to her family or friends. She grows more isolated. She has nothing else but him, so she lives with the violence until their story ends, one way or another. This story isn't a one-off. It's a story shared by 1 in 4 Australian women who have experienced physical or sexual violence from a current or former partner. And it's a story of 1 in 5 women since the age of 15 who experience sexual violence, including rape, 1 in 4 emotional violence, and 1 in 3 women physical violence. But it's also a story that affects children. More than half of the women who experienced violence had children in their care when the violence occurred. For victims and perpetrators, violence against women is the conclusion often reached after a life lived in a society where women and men aren't treated equally. But we, you and I, can change the narrative. Better education, policies, practices, support and funding can prevent this all too common story. When women and men have equal power, value, and opportunities in relationships and in society, violence against women is less likely. By nurturing caring, respectful, and equal relationships, and by creating equitable and inclusive communities, workplaces, and institutions, we can create a society of equality and respect, where violence against women is unthinkable. Let's change the story, because ending violence against women starts with gender equality.
Apologies, I didn't get that off Shed's. You can see the slides on the side. Sorry about that. This clip is available online on the Our Watch website, and you're free to use it to support any of your work. But what I think is important, and I find this, it doesn't matter who we're speaking to about this work, it's really important to make this, to try and put a positive frame around this work. So I'll see, hopefully you've got that next slide. I think it's really important because, you know, when we're talking about violence against women, it's really hard to find anything positive. I'd agree with that. But prevention, the work that everybody can do to change the environment so that we have less violence against women, is the work of hope. It is the work of the future, of future change. And so kind of in line with that, and always being respectful of the seriousness of the issue, we try and really frame the work in a positive way. So when you look at the actions here, we're changing those gendered drivers that I talked about before to say, actually, we are going to challenge the condoning of violence against women. We're not going to let sexist jokes go past in a tea room. We're going to promote women's independence, and we're going to do that deliberately and through positive action. We're going to challenge gender stereotypes. So when somebody says, well, men are better at this, or men are better at maths and women need to be good at being receptionists and so forth. We actually stop and we say, actually, that's not right, and that's a stereotype and an idea that's no longer useful, probably never was useful, and we're going to strengthen positive and healthy relationships between women and men. Now, this work, the importance of this work is that it's done in all the places we spend our time, and we call them settings, and they're the settings of our life, in our sport, in our faith places, in our workplaces, in our places of education, in our relationship with the media and so forth. And by their nature, and I'm coming back to the theme of today about how can men make change, because we haven't got far enough in gender equality yet, I might just stop sharing so that because we actually haven't got far enough in gender equality in our community yet, most of the places we spend our time, the settings of our life, are still, the influential roles are actually held by men mostly. Look around your life, whether it's CEOs of organisations or sporting clubs or our faith communities or what we see on television or our politicians. Most people in influence who are still holding a lot of the influence in those settings are actually men. So that means that as men, you have a genuine opportunity to be one of the men making change, to whether it's in your workplace, what are you doing about promoting gender equality? In your sporting organisation, what are you doing to make sure it's a safe and equal place? In your school, in your TAFE, all of those places. And I know that you have, when I look around Ballarat and surrounds, we've got men in leadership roles doing that. The other thing is that many of you will be involved on boards or on organising committees at the local footy netball club, at the car club, whatever your thing is, or in the CFA. All of those places are places where often men are in roles of influence, and knowing what we know now about violence against women, knowing what we know about gender inequality driving it, and that we all have an opportunity to shift the dial on gender inequality, and particularly those of you in leadership roles. Men making change is about acknowledging that many of you on this call, or many men in our lives, will actually be in positions of leadership and influence, and you actually have your hands on the levers of change. And I can't speak about this, but I think Scott spoke about it beautifully in terms of understanding that not through any malice or deliberate action, but men will have benefited from being men. They will find themselves in those positions sometimes as a result or through the benefit and the privilege of being a man. And so I ask you to look at that without being critical of yourself or rebelling or saying that's rubbish, but actually go, what's in that? Okay, if we're in this situation, this is how the world's developed, how can I now use that position of influence to help drive change, to help make change? The other thing is, and Scott touched on this as well, but as individual men, you also have a lot of power as parents, modelling healthy relationships, as partners, of course, as bystanders to challenge harmful norms and attitudes that don't value women as equals. And Scott touched on those things as well. So the final thing I'd say, because I can see we're just about out of time, is that I'd encourage you to make a start. This work is confronting. It's not... The work to prevent violence against women is often compared to seatbelts in cars or reducing smoking or sun cream and so forth. But none of those things really got into our DNA and asked us to reflect deeply on who we are and how we express ourselves in the community. So I'd just say, make a start. And if this work is new for you, then reflect, learn, reach out to your very good local resources, spend time speaking with women, speak to men who are doing work and might be a few years down the track, but start making the change and start with your own learning. And if you've been at this for a while, and I know a lot of you will have, then do more, keep doing more, keep challenging yourself, go to the next level and move from talking about it, move from being a man who doesn't perpetrate violence or who is actively on board to a man who is leading, who is making change. We're really lucky in this region. I've of course spent most of my career working in the Ballarat and Grampians region, and it doesn't matter where I travel around the country, I'm yet to see another region that pulls together and works together in the same way that Ballarat and the broader region do. So you have really good resources here locally. You've got the Communities of Respect and Equality led by Women's Health Grampians. You've got the White Ribbon Committee. I know that Ballarat Community, the local government, is doing some really amazing work. And of course, there's national resources like the White Ribbon website, like the Our Watch website. So I'll finish there because I can see Jade is back on screen. I hope that's been useful. I'm really happy to take questions, even if I answer them later on. But congratulations for your work here today, and thanks very much for the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you so much, Patty, and of course to Scott. A round of applause. And yeah, thank you once again so much for volunteering your time today. You've heard this morning the latest accounts on men's violence, abuse and harassment of women. And with those statistics, as Scott has mentioned and Patty has mentioned, it is easy to be discouraged. We ask that you please don't simply just, shake your head, hope that somebody else will deal with this epidemic of abuse against women and then just, brush it under the rug for another year. At White Ribbon Ballarat, we won't allow you to be an active bystander. You are going to get involved and make the best possible change that you can. We are a community action group committed to ongoing primary prevention all throughout the year. So we are asking for you to learn, to give and to take action. Today, you've heard the reality backed by 3 different perspectives on how men can make change, and that freedom comes from when men stop choosing violence and abuse. Change requires real social and cultural transformation, starting at the individual level. So if you would like to join White Ribbon Ballarat, please email the Ballarat White Ribbon Day @gmail.com. Popped it in the chat there. To join our community action group, if advocating on a broader level appeals to you, then you can head on over to the White Ribbon Australia website and register your interest to become a community partner. White Ribbon Australia receives less than 10% of their funding from the government, and White Ribbon Ballarat, we rely exclusively on community and local donations. Those donations help fund our primary prevention and advocacy work. I'll pop the details in there if you are interested. Any nomination, big, small or anything, would be greatly appreciated. And alternatively, you could choose to donate to White Ribbon Australia following that link. So sorry to overwhelm you with links there. I'm quickly rushing through. There is also on the White Ribbon Australia website a resource called How Men Can Make Change. It's a resource page where hopefully you can take what you've heard today to explore a little bit deeper, enabling yourself to challenge those cultural norms and expectations which basically create the conditions of men's violence, of abuse against women, and it continues to destroy both lives and families around this great nation. So we hope that you'll stand in solidarity with us women as we call for political, social and systemic change. So how can men make change? They can commit to learning, to giving and to taking action. All of us can. So please do so today. And thank you all for what you are already doing and for your actions after this event. We are working together for a future where gender equality is a lived reality and that Australian society is free from all forms of men's violence and abuse. If we do have time, you're welcome to stay around and to answer some questions from our panelists. I see that we have one here from Penny. I believe this is directed at Scott. She has asked, is there a difference in the effectiveness of the men's behavioural change programs between men who volunteer themselves for the program and men who are recommended?
It's a really good question, Penny. I think I don't know what the evidence would say, but anecdotally, my experience, in many ways, the guys who are mandated are easier to work with, even though there's more resistance, because change for them is often more profound. Men who are often coming on their own or off their own bat, or kind of what we call, almost like a quasi mandate where their partner's asking them to do it. In many ways, they feel like half the work's done because they've already acknowledged there's a problem. Acknowledging the problem is a really important step, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the behaviour changes. Because, as Patty's spoken about, the socialised nature of who we are, the gendered norms are really ingrained in identity. And so the change process for the, I've worked with many men over the years who have come voluntarily. They march for gender equality. They will be at white ribbon breakfasts, espousing the virtues of gender equality, but they're also violent and abusive in their relationship. So that's a real challenge in some ways. Mandated men, in some ways you kind of know where they're starting from. They're starting from a point where there's nothing to see here, there's no problems. So in some ways their movement can be much more profound, and can get to really interesting places that perhaps is harder for guys who have that kind of belief that they've already done part of the work. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, really well said. And once again, your wealth of knowledge on this, I agree with Patty. I could listen to you all day. If there are any other questions, yep. Penny has said thank you, that does answer her question. We have one other question from Libby. She's interested in how we can use common language to influence our settings of life. Are there language resources out there?
I'm not sure if this is for Scott or I, and I think there's two bits in there. I think, and I'm sure Libby will know this as well, that it's really important that we use accessible language in all of this work. And I presume the same is for Scott, but even our watch with our work, we need to base the work on evidence. So, we do research and we evaluate and we test and so forth. But it's actually really important that when we're speaking with people who we know we need to move along, that the language has to be accessible. So in my work, I say our watch's job is to make sure the people in the movable middle, the people who are not perpetrators of violence, but just haven't known about it or they haven't known what to do or what have you, that's you and me. It's people on the street. It's people, working in nil. It's people working in farms. It's everybody. That words like taking an intersectional transformative feminist approach generally makes people's eyes roll in the back of their head. So we actually have to meet people where they are and use language that is accessible and works for them. So I always say, and I kind of hold this, even though I'm working in our watch in this national role, it's a bit fancy. I kind of hold my regional roots very strongly and say, actually, if people are going to take our work and make it work in their setting, in their sports club, in their church or whatever, then they need to be able to do that, because if people aren't in the conversation, we're never going to shift the dial on violence against women. So I'm not sure if that was what you meant in that question, Libby, but I think it's a real challenge to keep doing that. And I do think that people need to be confident enough in the work to say, I'm going to use language here. Like my staff say to me, we have to use the word intersectionality to talk about the reinforcing drive. So how racism and homophobia and transphobia and ableism combine with gender inequality. But actually, when I'm in sporting clubs or in the community, I really need to talk about inclusion, because most people know what you're talking about. Now, technically, that's not quite right, but actually, does it get us close enough? Does it keep people in the conversation? So that's my take on that question. Thanks, Libby.
Well said, Patty, and I completely agree. It's definitely about being able to adjust your language to suit the room, really. And yeah, she has agreed that the use of accessible language is very, very important. I don't think we've received any other questions, so we have gone for exactly an hour, so I am happy to wrap up. Please don't forget to visit whiteribbon.org.au to learn how you can put today's advice into action. And once again, thank you so much to everyone for attending. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you so very much. And of course, thank you to our amazing panelists.
Thanks very much, Jade, and well done to everybody online as well. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.